Hi, welcome to week number 2 of the Scrap Block Quilt Sampler, where I'm going to be sharing with you every week 52 different blocks where you're going to be able to use your scrap stash and make some beautiful scrappy quilts. My name is Lori Dickman. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel. If you like what I'm sharing with you on my YouTube channel, please don't forget to like and subscribe so that you'll see all of the tutorials as I put them out. It also helps my channel to grow so that other quilters get to see the tutorials as well. If you haven't already seen my video on speedy solutions to cut and organize your scrap stash, you'll want to check that out. It will take you step by step on how to cut, sort, organize, store, and use your scrap stash. I'll have a link in the description box below, so make sure you check that out. Many of you enjoyed the pumpkin block that I shared last week, and if you haven't had a chance to look at that tutorial, I'll have a link to that down in the description box below, so make sure you check that out. But this week I'm going to share with you a variation of the Road to California block, and let's get started on that. So for this scrappy block, we're going to be pulling some squares from our scrap stash. I do have a PDF of simple instructions for the block. It is attached in the description box below, so make sure you either save that to your computer or print it out so you have it available for you as you're working on the block. So I went to my scrap stash, I went to my 5-inch bins and my 4.5-inch bins, and I pulled squares from these bins that are required for this particular block, for the Road to California variation. What we're going to need to make one of these blocks, for the 5-inch squares, you're going to need 2 lights, so I have my 2 lights, and you're going to need 2 mediums, so I have my 2 medium squares. From the 4.5-inch bin, I pulled 2 of the 4.5-inch mediums, and I pulled 3 of the 4.5-inch darks. So I'm making a scrappy block for my Road to California block. So to begin the layout of this block, you'll see that we're going to put the 4.5-inch darks in a diagonal, and the 4.5-inch mediums are going to be on the outside 2 corners. Then for these 4 squares, where the empty spaces are at the moment, we are going to be creating half square triangles using our 5-inch squares. And we have 2 mediums and 2 lights. And you are simply going to place the 5-inch squares right sides together. We're going to draw a diagonal line. We're going to sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance on both sides. We're going to cut on the diagonal line, open, press, and square them up to 4.5 inches. We're going to end up with a total of 4 of these half square triangles, which will fill in these spots right here. So let's go to the sewing machine and see how this will be done. So what we're going to do is create our half square triangles first, and I have taken my 5-inch lights and my 5-inch mediums, and I'm simply putting them right sides together, and I have drawn a diagonal line from corner to corner. I'm going to do that on both sets here. And then we are simply going to sew a scant 1/4 inch on each side of the diagonal line. Let me move this over so that you can see as I sew. And when I say a scant 1/4 inch, I mean a thread or 2 less than a 1/4 inch. That allows for the turn of the fabric when we press the seam open. So now I've flipped the triangles and I'm going down the other side. Now what we're going to do is simply cut on the drawn line, open, press to the dark, and then we're going to square it up. So I have pressed each of them open, and I've pressed it to the dark. Now each of these squares has to be squared up to 4.5 inches so that it fits in the block. So I am going to square each of them up. You don't have to have a 4.5 inch ruler that's exactly that same size. You can use larger rulers to square up your blocks. What you want to do is make sure that you use the diagonal line on your rulers, which is across there, and line it up on the seam allowance, which I have done here, and then cut away the excess. And there we have a 4.5 inch square that will fit the rest of the block, so it will actually be able to go into the square properly. And again, I'm going to line up the diagonal line on the ruler to that seam allowance in the square and match it up to the 4.5 inch lines, and then trim up the excess. And in this case, there's a little bit hanging off here too that I want to get rid of. So again, finding that diagonal line, lining it on the seam allowance, and I'm going to trim away this excess over here. There we go. So I'm going to do that to all 4 blocks, and I'll be right back. So you'll want to follow your PDF to help guide how to lay out the half square triangles within your block. And the light portion of the half square triangles actually face away from the center there, like that. And I mixed mine up a little bit so they're not right next to one another. So this is how it's going to be laid out, and then we're going to go ahead and web the block and start sewing down each side. One thing I do want to point out with regard to the rulers, every ruler has at least one diagonal line, and this particular ruler, this is the 9.5 inch ruler that I use to cut out or to square up my half square triangles. It only has one diagonal line, which is the 45-degree line. And that's the line that you want to look for on any ruler when you're squaring up a half square triangle. Identify which is the 45-degree angle on the ruler, and that's the line you're going to use to match it up to the seam allowances. So here we have the completed block. I have pressed it and squared it up to 12.5 inches. So this block is ready to be used in our sampler quilt, or maybe you'd like to make a whole bunch of these Road to California variation blocks and have fun creating your own quilt with this one particular block. I do have a link which I'll put in the description box below for my California Maze quilt, and it does use a version of this block which you might enjoy watching. So check out that tutorial and see if you enjoy that quilt pattern. You might want to try that one. I really enjoy being able to use my scrap stash to make beautiful quilts and totes and accessories. There's so many things you can do with your scrap stash, and it's wonderful to actually be able to use it and not just look at it being stored in your quilting studio. Let me know in the comments below how you plan to use the scrappy block patterns that I'll be sharing with you. Remember, there's going to be a total of 52 of them that you'll get to enjoy over the course of this next year. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned for next week for my week number 3 scrappy block pattern that I'll be sharing with you. Have a great week.